Hi folks, I hope that by now you've gotten more or less oriented to the course and have a good sense of how we're going to be proceeding from looking over the syllabus, and that you've been able to get your textbooks and start into some of the reading of the Gonzalez text. I should just say a word about the Gonzalez text that we're going to be using together as background reading for the course. You'll see, as every textbook, that Gonzalez has his own particular background and perspective, and that influences the way that he writes church history. Gonzalez is a Latin American Christian. He, I believe, is from a evangelical tradition, a Methodist background, I believe. And so you can pick up some of his particular questions, some of his particular biases, if you want to call them that, in the way that he works through some of the material. As I've mentioned, no church history is completely objective, and it's all perspectival. We're trying to give a balanced portrait of the people and the writings and the events that happen in church history. And so Gonzalez's voice is not the only voice that you'll hear, but it is one of them, and I hope that you'll be able to find a number of things to appreciate about the way that he tells the story. I think you'll find him fairly engaging to read and fairly accessible, and he'll fill in some details that will complement some of the stuff that we dig into a little bit more in the lectures and in some of the primary source reading and discussion that we get to do. I'd also like to thank you before we start into this week's material for the work that you did last week in giving personal introductions and your interactions there in the forums, and those are going to be really important as we continue on through the class, that everybody participates and contributes and comments on what others say, and that we interact and go back and forth there. So thank you for getting us started with that, and it really helps me to know who I'm working with in the class as well, so I appreciate that. This week's session of the course is called Christian Origins and the Apostolic Church, and that's really two headings in one, and as such the lecture is kind of divided into two parts as well, or two movements. The first half deals with issues around the origins of Christianity, specifically the distinction, the differentiation from Judaism, as well as the initial spread of the Christian movement from the city of Jerusalem, where it's initially centered heavily, to some of the surrounding Gentile cities in other parts of the ancient Near East. In this section, we're going to be working fairly closely with some of the material we have in the scriptures and talking a little bit about that, as well as some of the details we know from those first decades of history and tensions between Jewish and Gentile Christians, and between synagogue and the emerging first churches, and so on. In the second part, we're going to be devoting our time to a discussion of what we know about the Apostolic Church, the first kind of generation, the earliest writings that we have available to us outside of the New Testament writings, and looking at what they can tell us about the life of the church in those first few decades, around 90, 100, 110, 120 AD. I want to begin by reading a portion from Acts chapter 15. Then certain individuals came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And after Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with them, Paul and Barnabas and some of the others were appointed to go up to Jerusalem to discuss this question with the apostles and the elders. So they were sent on their way by the church, and as they passed through both Phoenicia and Samaria, they reported the conversion of the Gentiles, and brought great joy to all the believers. When they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and the elders, and they reported all that God had done with them. But some believers, who belonged to the sect of the Pharisees, stood up and said, "It is necessary for them to be circumcised," and ordered to keep the law of Moses. The apostles and the elders met together to consider this matter. Now that's a reading that perhaps we've heard a number of times before, and it's a good place to begin for what we cover today, because it really sets the tone as we make that move from the time of the New Testament scriptures into the first few decades after it, and some of the struggles that the church had to go through and the questions that it had to answer for itself. And so we begin with that story in mind, and we watch the scene unfold for subsequent decades. I hope that you have a good time working through this material this week.